So today we're going to start our journey of dividing up and taking a look at the phylum Arthropoda. We've gone through all of the animal phyla in just sort of a really brief summary to give you some of the characteristics of those. And now what we're going to do is concentrate on the primary phylum that we're really emphasizing in this course. However, later on when we get into what I call structures and functions, when we talk about digestion and excretion and respiration and nerves and muscles and all those types of biological functions that go on, we'll probably use the arthropods as one of our examples, more importantly, the insects, but then we'll compare that to ourselves, how we do it. And to me, it's important for you to know that there are various ways to respire. There are various ways to have a nervous system hooked together and so forth. And it leads to really interesting things that can happen. We'll show you in laboratory that a cockroach can run and fly without its head. Can you do that? Well, you can't fly in the first place, but if your head's removed, that's it. Nothing's going to happen. And it's really just because of the architecture of the nervous system with there, and we'll take a look at that. That's why, to me, it's always fun watching people get freaked out. They think they've swatted a bug or a spider or something, and it's still moving. And until you just completely smash it to smithereens, that it'll stop. And that's because of the architecture of the nervous system there. The first time you whapped it, it's probably been killed, essentially. But there's still ways that the legs can move, the wings might be able to flap, and some other things go on. So now we're going to take a look at the arthropod diversity, just the phylum Arthropoda, and we're going to take a look at the major groups in here. Again, I think it's important for you to understand these because some of these you're going to come into contact with. Sooner or later, you're going to see a spider. You need to know that. Sooner or later, you're going to be walking in the woods and you get a tick on you. You need to understand what that is. If you own a house, you're liable to get millipedes in the basement. What are these things? Where did they come from? How do I manage those? So you need to know some of that information. And to me, very importantly, just like when we talked about the mollusks, I love to eat mollusks. They're good food items in there. And we're going to find out that there's a group of arthropods, the crustacea, which also serve as food for a lot of us. And it's kind of interesting to me in some religious groups and their religion that things like arthropods are considered to be unclean, and you're not supposed to eat them. Yet in other religions, they're considered part of the fish group. And it's okay to eat them when you're not allowed to eat red meat, but you can eat fish. Oh, and by the way, that includes these arthropods. Well, to a biologist, really? Fish and arthropods they're two different phyla. But again, because of religious connotations and so forth, that's the way that they've come in there. Now let's start, here's those terms again. Let's start out with our terminology of what's going to define these arthropods. Okay, they have a true coelom. That automatically means that they are triploblastic. They have 3 cellular layers. And the mesoderm lines both the endoderm and the ectoderm, and the mesoderms form muscles, so they are coelomates. They're protostomates. That means they're first mouth. So in the development of the embryo, when that blastula invaginated to become the gastrula, that invagination is the mouth. So they're first mouth organisms. They also have segments in the body. Now, what other phyla did we talk about that had segmentation? Do you remember those? The earthworms, yes, the annelids. The annelids are segmented animals. But earthworms grow by adding more segments, and their exoskeleton is flexible. They make the exoskeleton just get bigger in there. Actually, we're segmented too. If you don't understand that, the next time you eat a fish, what do they always say in the fish? Cook it until the muscles are just flaky. What do you mean by that? Well, if you remove the skin, there are these layers that flake apart. You're looking at segmented muscles in there. So even vertebrates have segmentation in their bodies. And so being segmented is important. But in this particular case, what we find is that all arthropods have what is called a chitinous exoskeleton. They've got this shell that's made of a special polymer that's called chitin. And we'll talk about this later on. What's a polymer? I see most of you have a polymer in your hand. What do you have?
Like a chain of molecules.
Yes, it's chain of like molecules hooked together in such a manner that they make large complex chains, and they're usually joined together in such a way they're really tough to break apart. That's why we're so worried about plastics getting into the ocean. That's why a lot of the stores are now not giving straws out anymore, because those are all made of plastic. It's really tough to recycle those plastics. This tabletop, that formica that's on there, that's a polymer. Why did the university select that? It's tough. It can take a beating. And there can be hundreds of students in here, and it'll still look like it's supposed to look like, even though everybody's thrown their tablets or their books and things on there. It's tough. And so this polymer of this chitinous exoskeleton is tough stuff. Now, here's one of the problems, is that once this is polymerized, once this chitin has been polymerized, you can bend it, you can flex it, but you can't stretch it. It's not like a balloon. It can't stretch any longer. Now, that's different than the earthworm. Remember, the earthworm, it's got we call it a cuticle in this case, but that's really a soft exoskeleton that can expand and contract somewhat like a rubber or balloon or something like that. So if I've got this shell on the outside of my body that can't be expanded, how can I grow? I can't. Once I fill that chitinous exoskeleton, I have to make a new one that's bigger. And I have to get rid of the old one. I have to shed it or molt it. And so generally, one of the major features of the arthropods is that they have this segmented chitinous exoskeleton that has to be shed or molted on a regular basis in order for the animal to get bigger. The segments also, we believe the ancestral arthropod probably had paired appendages on every segment of the body, including the segments of the head. Now, does anything kind of resemble that we saw this week? Do any of you remember that polychaete worm? The little marine annelid that had these flaps sticking out. They had the little seedy on them that helped them move around and protect them and so forth. So in essence, it kind of looks like that, but if you look at those animals a little bit closer, you'll just see that those are just flaps of tissue that come out, and there's no real joints in there. So that's different. So in the arthropods, the name itself, Arthropoda, means jointed legs. And so these are the animals that have that exoskeleton. They have paired appendages on their segments, and those paired appendages are segmented. Now, if you think about it, your arm and legs are segmented. You've got, all the little bones in the hands and the wrist in here, and the bones in the forearm and so forth. But what's the big difference? Your skeleton is on the inside, while in the arthropods, their skeleton's on the outside. So the joints are going to actually be on the outside of it, not on the inside of that. We'll talk about it as we go along. How do you operate something that has joints on the outside as opposed to the inside? Our muscles run on the inside, and we have ligaments that attach to the bases of our different bones. And so when you move this muscle here, that moves this part down here. And that leads people to some weird things. Have you ever thought, where are the muscles in your fingers? Yeah, you don't really have any muscles in your fingers. If anybody has ever had a bad finger injury, what they're doing is they're rejoining the ligaments that run in there, and those ligaments run up here into the muscles that are in your forearm. So if you think about it, if you start moving and feel your forearm, you'll feel the muscles that are in there that are actually operating that. Now, another big feature is that virtually all of the extant, what do I mean? That means the currently living arthropods have the bodies, those segmented bodies, divided up into functional regions. Now, the insects have three basic functional regions. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. But if you take a look at a millipede, it looks like this little worm-like thing. It's got a head, and then it's got this long segment. Each one of the segments got a bunch of little legs on there, and so that would have a head and trunk region. Those would be if you take a look at a spider, it looks like there's this one big region with all the legs coming off of it, and then there's this bulbous thing at the back of it, the abdomen. So in that case, the head and the thorax are joined. We call that a cephalothorax, and then an abdomen. So as you can see, every subgroup of arthropods has a slightly different arrangement of these body regions, and we'll talk about those as we go through there. Again, since they are protostomates, they're going to have a ventral nerve cord. What did you have? You have a dorsal nerve cord. So the insect's nerve cord runs down, and a spider's nerve cord runs down its belly. A crayfish's nerve cord runs down its belly. All of them run down the belly, while when we get into the vertebrates, it runs down the back. Here's another interesting thing. The arthropods, we believe, probably evolved from animals that may have had a closed circulatory system, but because of the size and the way that they function, they basically lost a closed circulatory system. And what does that mean? You have a closed circulatory system. Your blood runs through arteries. The arteries go out into the body, into capillaries, little tiny vessels. Then the capillaries run into veins that take the blood back to your heart. So that's a closed circulatory system. In the case of the insects, they have what we call an open circulatory system. And what that means is that what was originally the blood cavity that would have held the blood has just been opened up and fills up most of the body cavity. Now, we'll find out most arthropods do have a pumping dorsal vessel. But this pumping dorsal vessel just helps slosh the blood around in the body cavity. It doesn't have that dorsal vessel connected to arteries, capillaries, and return veins. It's kind of, if you think about it, it seems like a fairly inefficient system, but when you're small, it works just fine. We're going to divide the arthropods. By the way, there are more arthropod groups than these two, but the other arthropod groups are all known only from fossils. So these are the only existing, or what we call extant, groups of arthropods. And so there are what we call the Chelicerates. These are the things that have little pincher-like mouth parts. So what happened, we think, in the ancestral animal here is that they had little leg-like structures around where the mouth was, but they figured out, well, if I put some little pinchers on the end of those legs and put it around the mouth part, I'll have something that can manipulate food and help shove it into the mouth. So the Chelicerates have chelicerae, that's what those pincher-like mouth parts are called, but they are little pincher-like things. Then we have the vast majority of living arthropods. By the way, at one time there were probably more Chelicerates than anything else, but let's think about this. If I'm a Chelicerate, how am I going to eat my piece of steak? Now, I got this piece of steak here, and all I have are these little pincher-like things. I probably can't eat that. In essence, most Chelicerates eat liquid materials. They have to rip open their prey and suck up what is liquid or soft into the mouth part. So if you think about it, Chelicerates, having chelicerae to eat with is a pretty inefficient system. On the other hand, what we find is in the Mandibulates, they also had these leg-like structures around the mouth, But what happened in those leg-like structures got a little bit shorter and shorter and stumpier, and eventually they developed some little bony-like or hard chitinous-like teeth on them, and they worked side by side. But now I could, if I've got that piece of steak, I can take a bite of it, and I can use these mandibles to chew it up and grind it up. So mandibulates can take solid materials. They can bite something and chew it up. And we feel that just that simple mode of eating, being able to take a bite of your food and chew it up and swallow it, is a much more efficient way to get food, and that's probably why the mandibulates are now the dominant arthropods that we see here on the earth. Now here are some of the classes. We'll talk about some of these classes. We'll see these in the laboratory. We've got examples of these, and we've got videos of a lot of these. We'll take a look at them in the laboratory next week. But when it comes to the chelicerates, by the way, there are more classes of chelicerates, but these are the only two. Many of the classes are, again, extinct. One of my favorite classes in here is the Eurypterids. You don't need to write that down. They're called water scorpions. These were chelicerates that lived back in the just past primarily in the Permian area, more than 300 million years ago. Some of these, what they look like is a giant scorpion. They had these big legs with the pincers on the front of them like a scorpion does, but they also had these little tiny chelicerae, and some of them reached the length of 12 feet. That's one big honking scorpion, okay? But it lived in the ocean, and it had to live in the ocean because if you're going to get that big and you have an exoskeleton, if you lived on the land, you wouldn't be able to support your body mass. But being in the ocean provides the buoyancy. You can get fairly large. You can be a fairly large arthropod if you're in water. But if you're out on the land, you're going to be a lot smaller because of that exoskeleton. Now, the existing classes that we have are primarily the horseshoe crabs. Have any of you gone to the eastern seashore and seen a horseshoe crab wash up? Yeah. Some of them have been out there. You probably thought, since we call it a horseshoe crab, you probably thought it was a crab. But if you ever flip one of those things over, if it's still alive, what you'll see is it's got a bunch of gross little legs in there. But if you look up where the mouth is, you'll see these two little pincher-like things going like this in there. Those are the chelicerae. Those are its mouth parts. Since it's a chelicerate, then it's not a true crab. That would be down here in the crustacea, which is a mandibulate. Most of the chelicerates you're going to come into contact with or be able to see will be the arachnids. What are some arachnids? Spiders, ticks or mites, scorpions, absolutely. And so those are some of the dominant ones that people are familiar with. There's actually quite a few different orders of those arachnids in there, but again, most of them are little tiny groups, not very many species, but most commonly you're going to come in contact with spiders and mites of some sort. Now remember that ticks are nothing more than parasitic blood-sucking mites. So when I say mites, that also includes the ticks. Now when we get to the mandibulates, remember now these are going to have, instead of pincher-like mouth parts, these are going to have chewing mandibles. They're going to have a pair of mandibles right at the mouth parts. These are the ones that are going to be able to take bites of their food and chew it up. Now wait a second. Have you ever had the experience of being bit by a mosquito? Yeah. Did it bite your skin and remove some tissue? No. It pierced you and sucked blood out of you. Oh yeah, that's because it actually squirts in some saliva. The mosquito spits before it sucks. and that saliva usually has an anticoagulant and a numbing agent in there so that you don't feel it, and the blood doesn't clog its sucking mandibulate mouth parts. But then you get an allergic reaction to those. Those are foreign proteins that have been inserted in your body, and so your body says, ooh, there's something here that's not supposed to be here. I'm going to tell you that it's not supposed to be here. And so you get that itchy welt after that. We'll talk more about that as we go along. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on is that we'll also find out, especially when we get to the insects, that we can modify those mandibles where they were originally just for chewing. We can now evolve them to where they become a little bit elongated and longer and longer, and now they act as little stylets that cut a little slit in your skin, and because of the way that they fit together, we can use them as a soda straw, so to speak, to suck up liquids for that. So we'll find out when we get to the insects, there are certain groups of insects that have piercing, sucking, mandibulate mouth parts. I know it gets a little confusing, but we'll get there. We'll take this step by step. Yes? Most of the silk that we see, and remember that spiders are only one group that make silk. The silk that you might wear if you're wearing a silk shirt or silk trousers or something like that, that actually comes from a caterpillar. And what it is a very interesting polymer. Remember that polymer that we talked about again? That hardens on contact with the air. And spiders produce this polymers, and caterpillars produce these polymers that when exposed to the air become bound together as these little chains. And what did I tell you about polymers? They're tough. And that's why people like, people that can afford silk, they liked it because it's super light material but tough. It was hard to break it apart, so they're polymers in that case. They're slightly different chemistry, but they basically are polymers that react with the air and polymerize. They come out as a liquid, but in contact with the air, all the little molecules that are in there all hook up into their little chains and make that polymer. And they're slightly different chemistry. They're slightly different precursor chemicals that each one of those animals produce. Okay? We'll get to that as we go along here. Now, in these mandibulates, again, there's some other classes of mandibulates. They're usually pretty rare and not easily found, but the ones that we're going to take a look at are these primary ones here. The crustacea, that includes the things like the sow bugs, the pill bugs. The crustacea you're familiar with are crabs, lobsters, and shrimp. But there's plenty of other crustacea. Most of the crustacea live in the ocean. And the crustacea is the second largest group of the arthropods. The largest group, of course, are the hexapoda, or the insects. We have some others that have a strange body. And by the way, the crustacea primarily have a cephalothorax and abdomen. We'll talk about that again. Then we have three groups of what are called myriapods. Myriad meaning many, poda meaning legs. And that includes the diplopoda, chilopoda, and the symphyla. And these are typified by having a head region and then a long trunk region, and on the trunk region, each segment has pairs of legs on it. And finally, the hexapoda. What does the name hexapoda mean? Six-legged. So those are the six-legged organisms. They have three pairs of legs. Those are also the ones that have those three body regions. They have the head distinctly different than the thorax, and that distinctly different than the abdomen.